Mind, Crime, Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss MacIntyre versus the Marxist left. As you may or may not be aware, Alistair MacIntyre is the author of After Virtue, which is a very interesting work. MacIntyre was originally a Marxist and then turned Aristotelian and then ended up being sort of like a Catholic influenced by Thomas Aquinas. So yeah, he's quite an interesting guy. Tim.
So today I'd like to defend why I think MacIntyre ends up being one of the best critics of Marx and Marxism on its own term. And I want to point out that MacIntyre himself is not an anarcho-capitalist libertarian, and he would be critical of it. Although I think anarcho-capitalist libertarianism, although that might be utopian, there's some more conservative versions are less utopian anyway. But Marxism, and I think MacIntyre has a line that it being somewhat bankrupt, or all modern moral theories being bankrupt. That aside, and I've been sort of trying to figure out how to win in a theoretical argument against the left. I think MacIntyre is one of the best critics of the Marxist left, because if you take what I'm going to do is I'm going to take his argument, I'm going to add some things and strengthen out some things he's made. Now maybe that's a sort of folly thing to do, but I tend to think in practice many people on the left, as Charles Murray and David Brooks point out, live right and think left. But theory again remains a problem. The left in debates will often bring up this or that bad event from American, English, or German history when debating or any society in the West. I'm going to get to definitions in a little bit. I'm going to lay out definitions in a little bit. But they think that they bring up bad events from history. And they'll say, what about the enclosures, or what about slavery, or what about this or that genocide? And oftentimes when libertarians engage in debates, they'll say that all the property titles are unjust, or they'll even say more radical things like the existing governments are unjust, but they're not necessarily full anarchists here. So, and my TLDR argument is, if the history of the West is the way the left says it is, we never tire of hearing about slavery, xenophobia, racism, and so forth. Why would this society bring about what they call the revolution or the utopian? And I think MacIntyre really zeroes in on this, or sort of the bankruptcy point. And he's quite charitable to the Marxists, probably much more so than he is charitable to Nozick later on. And I would like Swithin to read what to me is a comment near the end of it. I think it's it's one of the end of the chapters here. And he really goes into sort of the bankruptcy of Marxism. So Swithin, could you read that, please?
Secondly, as I remarked earlier, but Marxists moved towards power, they always tend to become Weberians. Here I was, of course, speaking of Marxists at their best in, say, Yugoslavia or Italy. The barbarous despotism of the collective Tsardom which reigns in Moscow can be taken to be irrelevant to the question of the moral substance of Marxism, as the life of the Borgia Pope was to that of the moral substance of Christianity. Nonetheless, Marxism has recommended itself precisely as a guide to practice, as a politics of a peculiarly illuminating kind. Yet it is just here that it has been of a singularly little help for some time now. Trotsky, in the very last years of his life, facing the question of whether the Soviet Union was in any sense a socialist country, also faced implicitly the question of whether the categories of Marxism could illuminate the future. He himself made everything turn on the outcome of a set of hypothetical predictions about possible future events in the Soviet Union, predictions which were only tested after Trotsky's death. The answer that they returned was clear. Trotsky's own premises entailed that the Soviet Union was not socialist, and that the theory which was to have illuminated the path to human liberation had in fact led into darkness. Marxist socialism at its core is deeply optimistic. However, thoroughgoing its criticism of capitalist and bourgeois institutions may be, it is committed to asserting that within the society constituted by those institutions, all the human and material preconditions of a better future are being accumulated. Yet, if the impoverishment of advanced capitalist societies is so great, whence are these resources for the future to be derived? It is not surprising that at this point Marxism tends to produce its own versions of the Übermensch, Lukács' ideal proletarian, Leninism's ideal revolutionary. When Marxism does not become Weberian social democracy or crude tyranny, it tends to become Nietzschean fantasy. One of the most admirable aspects of Trotsky's cold resolution was his refusal of all such fantasies. A Marxist who took Trotsky's last writings with great seriousness would be forced into a pessimism quite alien to the Marxist tradition, and in becoming a pessimist, he would in an important way have ceased to be a Marxist, for he would now see no tolerable alternative set of political and economic structures which could be brought into place to replace the structures of advanced capitalism.
That quote to me is one of the best outlines because, as I just stated, if you get into any debate with the Marxists, the first thing they'll do is, and I've always thought this was strange, and I'll see this with Sam Cedar, I'll see this with Ben Burgess, now whether or not they actually are Marxists, they're just socialists, is of some question. And they'll always point out that, like, oh, look at America, none of the properties are just, okay? None of this is just. All the institutions are defined by various isms and what-isms and so forth. If that is the case, if advanced capitalism, again, I know Murray Rothbard wouldn't say that we're living in a capitalist society, and that's true. That's in a way true. But I don't think that sort of subtracts from the point necessarily. But they identify this society as late capitalists and impoverished. Yet they're the ones making the claim that out of this we're going to get to a revolution, or we're going to create a better world out of it. I don't know where they're going to get the resources from. They go on and on about how unjust various historical property distributions schemes were. They'll bring up various enclosure acts again. They'll bring up various other acts that happened in there, the theft here or there, and so forth. Before I continue, I'm going to find a few terms. Again, I use the word West. The West, or more broadly, you can narrow or you can broaden it. It includes U.S., Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Germany, France, Italy, Austria, and probably Russia. So we're pointing out again that the Soviet Union, Trotsky society itself, was part of historical Christendom of some variety. So again, if Christianity is a religion of patriarchy and xenophobia and racism, then that's the entire Cold War happened by their points in a society that is predominantly all those isms. And furthermore, you could also use another word to describe the West, which is white. This is venturing off the reservation somewhat. White gets a lot of work out of the way. The modern day left, as I just described, use this word all the time. They will first say that it doesn't exist, but then they say that whites are the root of all evil of some sort. Again, to point out that Marx, Engels, Zizek, Kant, Hegel were all, by modern standards, that word, or Western. Zizek himself will say the heritage of Europe is Marxism. And again, take the Washington Post definition too. Instead of using the word West, you could use white. You could just say, well, this actually includes Japan, South Korea, Singapore, who now are like LARP as sort of white Westerners, or look toward them. And again, if you take demographic data seriously, South Korea will be a Christian country at some point anyway. So my argument, which I'm making the term to say the West, most of the actual events that the left talks about happened in societies that are part of it. So the bankruptcy of late capitalism is true in the Soviet Union. Is it true in the United States? Is it true in Germany? There isn't some sort of ideal, or Britain, there isn't some ideal untouched society out there. But I'm going to get back to my argument here after terms. I don't want to get too bogged down in terms. But if this phenomena, as described above, which I will call the West, is so rotten, and mainly about all these various isms, how can they actually create a better society from this rotten society? Sam Cedar will just get done explaining how terrible the origins of, or the 1619 Project gets terrible explaining how the origins of the United States are, or Britain is, and then they'll make the claim that we can actually create a new society which is better. Now, whether or not it is as bad as they say it is of some question. I don't necessarily agree with that. If you take, there actually are a lot of just property acquisitions throughout the United States. The Manhattan was sold for beads, but land was super abundant. William Penn bought much of where current day Philadelphia for perfectly legitimate reasons. Horses came, but those sort of empirical arguments are totally forgotten. And of course, the Aztecs, Han Chinese, and Ottomans weren't particularly nice. or liberal, or Marxist for that matter. And again, Keith Preston has this great article, which I encourage everyone to read on Attack the System, called Marxism is Alien to Me as Christianity, written by an indigenous native, Indian, and then Marxists treated the indigenous people quite poorly. All those things aside, we'll just zero in on, what flies as capitalism, or what the left calls capitalism. They're the ones who think that we can create a new society out of this sort of rotten society. So actually, a person like Neil Ferguson, or your sort of standard American patriot or English patriot, has a better case to make for creating utopia. I mean, Neil Ferguson has a book, Why Britain Made the Modern World, why the British Empire made the modern world. It's somewhat of a neocon book. And actually, Christopher Hitchens, when he advocated for U.S. UK to invade Iraq, he was doing it precisely for those reasons. And Christopher Hitchens has an interesting thing about nihilism. If the left thinks that the Taliban is actually superior to their own society, in a way, they're these specters of pessimistic Marxists. There used to be the specter of State Department socialists. I think the specter of pessimistic Marxists is a strange specter. In a way, I'm just implying more holistically the class analysis, which most left wingers interpret as ad hominem. If you make any, a movie that I always found was interesting. I know some people on the right, the traditional right, won't like it, but is the Hunger Games. And one of the things a lot of Western audiences don't get is that they are probably living in the capital city. What most people like Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, Ben Burgess, Marx, Hegel, they were all of the richest societies. If you take class analysis seriously, the real class divisions are between developed and undeveloped societies, which is why Marx advocated for international revolution, not local ones. It was changed somewhat. So I'm just sort of implying it more holistic. Of course, they always interpret this as ad hominem. And actually, that itself is somewhat irrelevant, because, again, that's the second part about, virtue, which is another of MacIntyre's key topics here. But the degree in which the impoverishedness of the current existing society, and actually this is one of the interesting things about the pan-anarchist Keith Preston. He's so, in some ways, also pessimistic, but he doesn't really think you're going to build some revolution out of from the Bernie Sanders movement. But again, he in my view correctly, he'll dispute it, but in my view, when his enemies call him right wing at times, I think actually in a way it's true. But nonetheless, for all the hostility that is directed at sort of, traditional United States, traditional Britain, traditional Germany, traditional whatever, those are the ingredients which they want to create a new society out of. And I don't really see why. It's worth pointing out most left wingers work in universities in America, and the elites, so to speak, and they are, many universities were set up to Christianize the natives, or were set up as states, as land grant universities on native grant. And again, go back to Christopher Hitchens' comment on Chomsky. You can call a school Sequoia, or Cherokee, or whatever, but it's just an empty gesture. And the emptiness of the gesture, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't do anything. All right, so there's not going to bring about a revolution here. And this is where we get this sort of neat new phenomena called woke capitalism, which, actually Zizek, again, points out is that the woke capitalists, in a way, are capitalism profiting off, a sort of phony revolution. Actually, if I get cynical enough, I actually sort of, in a strange sense, I think it's hilarious, that Raytheon paints various slogans on its air. That to me is hilarious. That's going to make it even stronger. So this comes back to sort of the specter of pessimistic Marxism. Considering how critical they are of the existing society, I find it highly unlikely that a revolution will come. The third worldist might make it a good argument, although Western ideas have sort of, in a way, went around the world anyway, in some ways or another. If you look at the conflict going on in Nigeria, the conflict between Islam in the East and Christianity in the West. It's not there's no, in a way, it's gone everywhere. Islam is tricky, And the Taliban are interesting. The Taliban, in some ways, are a very older society, as René Girard talks about. The Taliban can rule Afghanistan and Iraq, and they're actually going to do it well. But I don't think you confuse either of them with feminism or liberalism. Now, I'm not saying that as an insult to the Taliban. And again, actually, North Korea is a kind of monarchy of a sort, bizarrely enough. It's kind of the worst version of a monarchy. Same way with Napoleon, he's an interesting figure as well. He's, in one way, he's a republican. In other ways, he's sort of genociding emperor. So, what do you make of my comments on the phenomena of pessimistic Marxists and the likelihood of a revolution happening in the West, if the West is so rotten and terrible as they will routinely state and never stop reminding people on the right they are about various topics from land to the existence of institutions? Swithin?
It's difficult. I mean, basically, if you take the problem is, if you take the Marxist views consistently, they have to apply the existence of the bourgeois logic on all the bourgeoisie, which basically includes themselves, because in almost all cases, the Marxist revolutionaries have been in the upper middle class of societies. Marx was obviously one himself. Engels. Lenin was far from a relatively poor family, at least in the time in Russia. So the question arises, why is it not the case that their criticisms apply to themselves? And so effectively what they need to say is that there's somehow they've sort of escaped the herd, and they can observe the herd as to how it's behaving and then sort of inform the herd of how to revolt. Now, let's suppose they can do that. Then the question is, well, why would one expect the sheeple, as it were, to be of good revolutionary character? Which again is not obvious as to why they would, because if they've been infiltrated by all these capitalist ideals and etc., why are they going to start forming worker councils and syndicates and try and revolt and form a new utopian society? That would seem somewhat odd, unless, of course, they would say that actually the working class eventually will somehow shed its false consciousness. Now, as to why they would shed their false consciousness, to a large extent, is unexplained, unless it's just a case of, well, they will recognize the truth when it is presented to them, because they'll see it in their class interest, and then we can start up from the bottom. That's probably the best kind of argument you could use. But even so, once anybody of the working class gets into positions of some sort of power as a leader effectively like representative of certain councils or other sort of post-revolutionary positions, what is to stop them acting in their own interests in the same way as the Ancien regime did in France, or the capitalist class of the 19th century? It would seem that the traditional Marxist critique of those sort of institutions would equally apply to whatever institutions were ever realistically going to be created. So I just don't see how, on the Marxist terms, even if they don't apply it to themselves, that they can somehow get these institutions, unless, of course, it's just a case of, well, we're an elite, we're better than all the other elites that have existed. If you give us power, we'll create utopia. I suppose that might be the position they hold.
Can I cut in here?
Yeah,
sounds like a Nietzsche and Übermensch here, which is one of the chapters, Nietzsche or Aristotle. But I want to sort of backtrack to that question, ask it better. With respect to the structure of society, because the Marxists will say, we don't hate the person, we hate the system, or we hate the class system. Now, forgetting them themselves, we'll just take their analysis as a kind of a black box. You know, the U.S. government was founded by, had I think 3/4 of the founders of the American Revolution were slaveholders, I think, or something like that. Britain, of course, I imagine you could find a list of atrocities some kings did with respect to the left of some sorts. These are the societies that they want to, have the revolution happen in. The structure of the existing society is quite impoverished. Jeff Bezos owns more than whatever, and so forth. You can make a long litany of terrible things. They'll always list them. And, what are the odds of the structure of society actually being formed if it's as bad as they say it is? What do you make of that, Swithin?
Well, it's just highly unlikely to happen. I mean, why? How would we expect the alterations to take place? How are the sort of structural changes required to bring about this position when there's all these sort of inequities? I mean, it's how on earth is that going to be possible if it is the case that you hold the sort of economic determinist Marxist view? Now, that said, you could then claim, well, you could take a sort of position of, I suppose, with respect to political power, it's associated with, like, David Hume mentions things similar, whereby, well, really all the power rests on implicit sort of acquiescence. Well, no, on the acquiescence of the majority of the population. And so if the many decided just not to comply, then there could be a revolution. But that doesn't seem to me to sound like traditional Marxist analysis, because then you're outside the scope of sort of economic determinism. You're sort of getting into more of a ideas driving history rather than economics, which isn't traditional Marxism.
With respect to the view on the current society, one of the odd features I noticed, and this is actually, this is why I think MacIntyre is good, but I think he's being slightly unfair or not taking seriously his argument. One of my most interesting books, I think, is the conflict divisions point. And I made this point in the Why the Left Won't Abolish the State episode we did as well. The conservative or the reactionary or the paleocon or the paleo-libertarian or even the neoconservative in a way, at least domestically, has a much smaller vision. They're not going to try to reinvent the property system or the family or the firm. So the sort of traditional patriot, and MacIntyre talks about the values of traditional patriotism in one of his chapters himself. He does, of course, in some ways, virtue signal toward the left in a way at times. But all things considered, the traditional patriot who likes his society, who's not constantly sort of bashing it and saying it's terrible, they sort of in a way have a claim to create a better society, or at least go back to a better society, or sort of take certain elements of the past and create a better society, or create a society that's equally as good and pass it on. MacIntyre has a point about chess. You want to pass on. You play the game of chess eventually, but the whole community advances along no one cheats, and he makes this analogy of morality. You sort of pass it on. You pass it on to future generations. Hopefully as good as condition as it was, if not better, to future generations, so to speak, as you tie to the past. Some of the current reactionaries seem to dislike the current society, but at least they at least claim to like the past of some kind. The Marxists, the further they go back in the past, they seem to actually hate it more until you get to sort of like hunter-gatherers. But then that's sort of strange society anyway. And maybe they idealize certain periods. What do you make of that line of argument and MacIntyre's comments on patriotism? Go ahead.
I would agree with respect to the reactionaries and the Marxists, is that broadly speaking, you could say that the reactionaries are generally fond of the past, or the pretty recent past. And it is interesting that the only sort of societies historically that the Marxists will treat well are the hunter-gatherer societies, probably because they didn't have the same concept of land ownership in particular, because they were hunter-gatherers and nomadic, and so they never sort of permanently circumscribed any sort of area as theirs for like perpetual use over a time. And so it's interesting. So the original sin, as it were, in the Marxist view, is sort of probably agriculture. Everything was kind of okay before then. That was the golden age of hunter-gatherers. Whereas for the reactionaries, well, depending where you go, but economically and sort of socially, it's most, well, depending who you talk, the proper reaction is probably the Industrial Revolution. And then the normicons is the 1960s, but that's boring. The genuine sort of societal change really hits in with sort of like the Industrial Revolution. And that's where, you still have the sort of the societal effects of those changes. So I think that's where the left and the reactionaries sort of diverge with their sort of historical perspectives, which I think just make it somewhat different in their way of looking at things, even though they may have sort of similar critiques of the current society. Obviously not on like the reactions and the cultural issues in the same way, but economically to some extent they can. Could you just remind me of your MacIntyre question?
The MacIntyre question is with respect to tradition. One of the elements of Marxism seems to be a break from tradition. And if I think if I understand MacIntyre's argument is that virtues can really only be passed on through tradition of some kind, and they sort of throw away the virtues, which is why he views Marxism as sort of a Nietzschean. In practice, a lot of the common aspects of it just becomes sort of a Nietzschean will to power fantasy, which is why you get the year zero experiments and things like that. Now, of course, MacIntyre would criticize anarcho-capitalists for doing the same thing. I admit some of them do that, which is funny enough, it's the left and caps that do that kind of stuff anyway. But what do you make of that line of argument that MacIntyre is making there with respect to tradition, and this sort of break from tradition they want to have?
Oh, yes, certainly. The Marxists are more self-consciously reinventing society, and that is very much a break from tradition. The reactionaries will have taken things like family, business, and say the traditional virtues, thrift, hard work, etc., as given and as good. And what we need to do is just sort of what we've effectively got with this sort of reactionaries is we have a garden, but it's overgrown, and we just kind of need to kind of trim it and sort of get it back into good order. We've got sort of a garden, whereas the Marxists don't really see anything as natural in the same way. It's more that everything is an artifact, and what you kind of have is maybe can't think of a good analogy, but it's almost as if it's probably a stupid example, like a playground, like kids just go, oh, it's a bad playground. What do? Oh, we just need to bulldoze it and start again. There's no sort of like something there that's permanent, which is sort of like being molded to one direction or another. It's just like we should start again. MacIntyre's point about virtue is interesting. I mean, it really goes back to sort of the question of how do you become virtuous? How do you become sort of like a better human, whatever you mean by better in this context? And a lot of the time, it's imitation. You learn from somebody else, and then the question, well, then of course you get a regress problem. But practically speaking, who do you learn from? You learn from your parents, you learn from other people, etc. And so these sort of virtues are kind of passed on. But if you're trying to sort of reinvent society from the beginning as a conscious break, then you kind of have to create the new values. And again, the new values is like a difference of theoretical system, which is kind of like the new playground. There's nothing really that's there beforehand that we're trying to use and sort of refine. It's just we need to start afresh. So in that respect, I do think the Marxists do that, and MacIntyre is correct on that point.
I wanted to divorce the Social Democrats, probably not Marxists. I mean, Keith Preston debated two of them recently. Ben Burgess and someone else, I forget his name. But there's some question of always with categorization here that it's sort of on-running problem of all discourse analysis here. I mean, of course, Chomsky famously calls the Soviet Union right-wing phenomenon anyway. So maybe the tankies are actually right-wing anyway, because according to Chomsky's definition, the Soviet Union was right-wing, and the tankies think that Mao and Fidel Castro are worth defending in some ways. All those problems aside, the point with respect to, I think, virtues, the imitation point, which sort of mirrors Rene Girard's point in his triangle thing. I've yet to see these sort of year zero phenomena come through. You're always going to sort of imitate some aspect of the past in a way. It's somewhat inescapable. One of the interesting comments that Zizek made is that Zizek was actually complaining because anytime something bad happens in Africa, you'll always bring out some Belgian or British or German policy from the 1800s. And even when they do bad things, they'll say it's actually an inheritance from the whites, right? So I find these arguments to be hilarious. So even when Africans do evil, it's actually all whites' faults. Now that's with respect to them. But more domestically, I don't see how any escape, which is actually why the third worldists make the point that the sort of Western working class is not revolutionary. Now, third worldism is a non-persona; it's not allowed to be brought up in certain circles, which is because they're just social democrats in actual practice, which in some ways is a good thing, as MacIntyre points out, because it just would become crude tyranny or some sort of Lenin's ideal project. How do you get there? Well, you should have to make a complete break, and I've yet to see the ingredients to make a complete break. Maybe if you found like the Singalese, which is sort of an isolated group, you could turn them into sort of perfect Rousseauian fantasy, maybe. But these sort of existing societies, I don't know. I don't see where you get the energy or the attempt to do it. And I see this sort of imitation point about the virtues, and a lot of virtue imitation is good. MacIntyre praises, like the sort of historical Jacobins, interestingly, viewed that productive work was good. They did not want people to wear long. They did not want people to wear long beards. The absence of beards. Beards were associated with the ancien regime. So they had standards. And again, in some ways, interestingly, the actual societies actually sort of pulled a Marxist revolution in name, whether they were in theory is another question. They actually had to sort of take and co-opt certain virtues of the past in a way, and in particular in the military as well. That's another area where I think Stalin had to actually go into sort of traditional Russian patriotism, I think, to win the Second World War. Of course, the Americans and British helped by sending them lots of money. But all those sort of historical points, I want to go back to theory here, which is my second question. What is Marxism relationship to Aristotelianism, or the idea insofar as it views humans as somewhat teleological and predictable of a phenomena in a way? Because if humans will, and that's the sort of Humean problem, if humans' wills are just sort of fundamentally irrational, which I think is Hume's claim, and that's another point that MacIntyre points out. It sort of makes these sort of table values that they sort of want to create sort of infinitely fungible. What is the relationship between Marxism and sort of Aristotelianism? And this is more in Derby Hill House. I'd sort of like you to sort of make some comments on this.
Well, Marxism is, I wouldn't say Aristotelian as such, but it certainly has the teleological element, which really disappears in the early modern period, mainly when Newton comes along with his physics and everything is sort of like matter and motion. So the idea was that there was nothing really in reality which was going in a particular direction. You know, it was just all matter in motion. Whereas Marx is like, no, there is a shape to history. That it is going somewhere. Although, to be fair, I mean, the way this is sort of inheritance of Christianity to some extent, where you get to like the Whig theory of history, you know, the progress, and we sort of, and you're going to get secularized views of sort of the millennium, which you could argue Marxism actually is as well, really, in that respect. That you could immanentize the eschaton, as some people like to write. That is, you basically bring sort of like what is sort of the future heavenly state onto earth now. You bring it here and now. And that, I think, is certainly true with respect to Marxism. Now, whether it's Aristotelian, it's only got the teleological aspect. Marx, though, will treat, although what he does do is Marx is sort of like treats people as a particular class who, by of their nature of being a member of this class, will act in a particular way. But again, that's all rooted into sort of like the economic substructure, which ultimately drives everything. But that is a sort of an Aristotelian-like approach insofar as, well, you basically treat members of particular classes as a separate substance, and by being a different substance has different sort of inherent tendencies. So in that respect, you could say that Marxism is to some extent Aristotelian, although it's sort of, I think, a bit far away from that. I mean, the obvious link is Hegel when it comes to sort of Marxism and sort of like the thesis, antithesis, synthesis sort of moving through. Although I remember people claiming that was never really in Hegel, but anyway, is typically attributed to him. And you have these reactions and counter reactions, which then produce a synthesis, and then eventually this will reach a status of perfect end state. That's not really Aristotelian in itself, but the tendencies of certain things in the world, they generally have that, rather than just being based on will as some sort of independent or capricious manner, is to some extent Aristotelian. So I think that's a broadly fair position.
The teleology point and the sort of viewpoint in history, I always thought was strange coming from them. I still, in this regard, I am somewhat of an anti-teleological thinker. In a way, I think certain events can happen for no particular reason, just because sort of a motive reason. Although I'm not the best at defending certain theories about that, partly because it's sort of like an anti-theory in a way. If you're trying to explain why something, if you're trying to explain that things happen for no reason with a reason, it's sort of contradiction in a way. But I'm just going to move out of this and sort of approach the sort of the second part, which is more the Marxist view on man. I'm going to sort of circle back to this question here. The one of the things I like about MacIntyre, and one of the things he brings up, the Homeric societies in a number of his chapters. Now again, he makes the point that they may not have existed, and I'm somewhat skeptical of the sort of Aristotelian ethics myself. But I'm not against them, partly because they don't have much power in our world in a way, except like actual like power. So it's gonna get rid of the existing thing. But the view of the man they have is also quite interesting. The virtues, as MacIntyre, is something to be attained, to be better, or to be good. It's something you have to work toward. And actually, in Homeric societies, people would force you in a way to do it. They were also class-oriented societies. Nobles had certain degrees. People were owed certain things were owed to people, and so forth. To bring about, and this is a point that Thaddeus Russell made about in his argument with Michael Brooks, to bring about socialism would require a lot of virtue or meetings or work. You could use one of those three words. And that's actually the comments he made in this Freedom of Slavery. That sort of like Roman patricians had to like work to maintain the position. Same way with Jeffersonian patricians as well. They should have had to work to maintain position. Same way with Jeff Bezos in a way. And that like organizing, and MacIntyre's the line that absolute power co-ops absolutely, and so forth. So like maintaining the revolution or getting there requires virtuous man of some kind, who is courageous, who is has a certain kind of prudence and hard work, and in a lot of ways they just undermine these virtues at certain areas. They don't think you should work hard. They think you should rebel. They make claims that in the future you won't have to work, or everything will be perfect. You can fish in the morning. And again, some people actually might be able to do that in a way thanks to technology. So maybe we could set this society up and it's a perpetual motion scene. Once you set it up, it's all good and going. But setting it up is going to require a lot of work, virtue, or skill of some kind. What do you make of this point here with respect to man? The whole point of virtue ethics is you attain something that you don't have currently, which is related to Christianity in a way too. Swithin?
I would agree. I mean, this is a similar point that Todd Lewis makes about the current left in general, that they are really not a sort of revolutionary character. If you go to the sort of early 20th century, they were serious. They organized properly. They were relatively ascetic. They were wanting to bring the revolution. They were very diligent in attempting to bring it. That needs like fortitude, diligence, bravery, etc. These virtues that you require to then bring around the sort of utopian. Although I suppose this gets into some conflicting sort of Marxist positions as to what the utopian society will look like. I suppose you could distinguish between those who have a stronger view on scarcity and those who don't. Those who don't, more of a cultural left, would be like, well, yeah, we might need the virtues to get in there, but we can lose them when we are in the perfect state because, well, you don't hard work and diligence because it's a land of plenty and land flowing with milk and honey. Whereas those who realize, well, actually, society, resources are, scarce, and even in the socialist utopia, there's not going to be absolutely enough for absolutely everybody all the time. So you're going to kind of have to work and produce. If you held the former position, then the Marxism and the utopian society could probably continue. But as soon as the virtues were removed, then there's nothing to stop sort of like just standard naked egoism taking place and people shirking, etc. You kind of have to have some discipline to keep it there. If the man shall not work, he shall not eat attitude. Otherwise, there is no way the social society can continue.
I would agree as well. And there was a comment that there's some utopian community, and interestingly enough, the cupboards were locked. And this actually occurs even within Hutterite communities. I was sort of reading up on that, but sort of one of the critics someone made of them. Hutterites are sort of a Christian group of the Anabaptist sector. Now they perform it very much so. They sort of have a paradise. I'm not criticizing them in any major sense. Although I think most people, if they were positioned in Hutterite society, would be worked to death very quickly. Based on the hours they work. Same with the Amish and so forth, or sort of traditional Catholic communes. But one of the things they lock the cupboards. Or that was in the socialist utopian. They locked the cupboards, so the food cupboards, so people couldn't get to them during the day, which is sort of an interesting point to be made about the sort of nature of man. Again, this goes back to my earlier point that MacIntyre, of course, himself says he's a critic of capitalism. But within capitalism is the idea that man's motives are, if man is virtuous and great, then why do we need a government? Or why do we need a government? And why do we need a revolution anyway? if man is so great, or just, I mean, man is the one who creates the structure of society at the end of the day, or else it's just natural scarcity, which we can do our best to change. And I think the Industrial Revolution actually did a lot to change it in our favor. Although, of course, the left doesn't think so. The left thinks, they take this sort of environmental Malthusianness toward it. They think that it's actually made it worse off. It'll bring up climate change and all these other factors, or biodegradation and so forth. All those things withstanding, the sort of the virtues in creating a society remain key, and you can't, if you're going to create a society like that, you can always get there, and it's just a perpetual motion machine, but getting there remains a problem, and I don't see it in the existing stock of them. And if anything, they're somewhat runaway, not all of them. I mean, I'll be fair to Ben Burgess and Sam Siegel, they'll debate people, but if you sort of dig into their theory, are they really Marxists with a capital M, or just social democrats? And again, the existing United States is, as they point out, is heirs of slavery. If you want to take a 1619 or whatever project, or whatever view of American history, or over gory view of English or American or German or Italian history you want seriously. Now, I like the West's history. I visited Athens twice. I think Athens is beautiful. I think the Greeks were very interesting. I mean, the American founders modeled their system of government off the Greeks, and even the Oliver Cromwellians, they viewed themselves as Old Testament prophets in a way, as MacIntyre points out. So they were appealing to older traditions. My final point is about beating the prospects of it happening, which is sort of beating the false class consciousness, which is one of those ideas that, if you take them seriously, it seems like it has to be defeated. And again, I don't see any aspect of defeating this, which relates to the nature of man, which is my second part here. Man seems to be a dodgy creature, so to speak. Now, whether it's bad, whether we're all in chains, whether we're born free and are all in chains, or it's the other way around, is of some question. But as you were talking about before on our children overrated episode, children themselves are incredibly violent. Did they learn that from their parents in the first 6 months? Who knows? Who knows? These are sort of, in a way, unanswerable questions. But I want to sort of get to the final question here with you. Do you think the revolution will happen? Marx, of course, says it's inevitable. Marxist not only says it's inevitable, so it's a theological revolution. Someone made the comment that he's so far ahead of the curve, he's behind the curve. I don't think it's going to happen, and for precisely the reasons they oftentimes state. The society here of late capitalism is impoverished, and if I understand correctly, Marx was an accelerationist of some kind, although people will deny that. He thought he had to sort of get to the end, and then it would bring about. And that's such a point that's often brought up. That's another strange agreement the far right and far left has. There are sort of acceleration tendencies in both aspects of them to bring about some sort of singularity of some variety. What do you think of the prospects of revolution, and as a sort of summary of all the concepts we went through, as well as MacIntyre? Swithin?
The proletarian revolution will never happen because I'm not aware of any proletarian revolutions ever existing. The revolutionary class has always been the upper middle class. They're the only ones who have time to devote to revolution because the working class are working and can't have time to devise plans to usurp the current paradigm. Now, whether there'll be future revolutions, yes, probably, but not of sort of the classic Marxist type. Now, you could well get upper middle class intellectual types who try and foster revolution to impose the new proper type of socialism. I think that's entirely possible. But you aren't going to get the pure proletarian revolution, which is the end of history. That's simply not going to happen. You are going to get revolutions of the sort. I mean, the American hegemony from the post-Second World War period is probably declining to some extent, although I think its decline could well be overstated. And it's different building a film vat, and you're going to and there's going to be revolutions of sorts. I mean, you could argue that, although somewhat minor, you could claim that the Reaganism and Thatcherism of the 80s was like a revolution in respect of how governance operated and the relationship between the state and the market. So there would be revolutions of sorts, and I think much greater ones than that, because I think it's a relatively minor change. I mean, interesting, Keith Preston posted recently that in pretty much all parts of America now, as a third of the population have secessionist tendencies. That's sort of a revolution of sorts. But as I say, onto strict Marxism, that the Marxist proletarian revolution simply will not happen. I don't think it ever has happened, and no expectation that it will.
No expectations will. And again, I want to conclude here. I don't agree with the empirical claims or the sort of factual claims that the West is as bad as they say it is. And this is not even bringing out other side views. Interestingly, Turkey has probably going to take a much stronger role in affairs of Lebanon, Syria, and Iran probably going forward. I wonder if the Americans really might look longingly back at the Americans, British. They might not. They might prefer Turkish rule or Ottoman rule, whatever you want to say. I'm somewhat of a defender of the West. So I'm not a neocon in that regard. I think for other reasons that we should be out of there. So don't confuse me for that. I don't think it's a fight that is worth to be had there anyway. But again, the claims they make, the common claim they'll make, is an argument against their revolution, not an argument for the revolution. If universities in the United States are founded by a government and run by a government which you say is run by white supremacists, you need to explain to me why that actually can work. That makes no sense. And just I don't think it's that bad anyway. And I think that existing countries outside of it are much more of the sort of exact all the features you said much worse. Which again, this is an area where the strange bedfellows occur. Far left and the far right agree on everything. They just disagree on minor questions like, whether you think that these things should be done or not done. But in this regard, I remain a strict sort of plumb line libertarian. That's sort of my position. Now, again, MacIntyre would probably consider that laughable, and he might be right. But my opinion is this is where you have to bring in other works, and sort of like the existing society described by the enemies is in some ways, some forms, moderately capitalistic of some variety. There are still firms. Actually, funnily enough, the firms have, co-opted the language of revolution while maintaining a sort of structure of corporate capitalism. And it's quite, if you look in a Machiavellian terms, it's quite brilliant. The customers they're most afraid of are like the Colin Kaepernicks. They're not afraid of, to use a football analogy, Peyton Manning. They're afraid of Colin Kaepernick. So they're going to, do whatever he says. In the 1960s, they were afraid of, the Christian right in the United States. So they went after other groups. But the basic sort of corporate capitalist structure. Now, I would want to overthrow the statist aspect of it, and whether that's actually possible is some question. But interestingly, MacIntyre puts Rawls and Nozick could be a stand-in for Rothbard or David Friedman. Again, he's the sort of respectable ANCAP. He's sort of, by respectable, I mean is the normies at least know of his names. Although I like Nozick, I've read his book Anarchy and Utopia. I think it's I've read most of it. I haven't read every word of it. But I think it could be laughable, plumb-line libertarianism, or sort of but reforming the social democratic state into some virtuous entity, as Keith Preston would be called, putting the mouse in charge of the cheese. I'll keep waiting until you get that. That seems like that seems like a long coming. And actually, you talked about secession, Chris With, and secession might happen, but secession again is not anarcho-capitalist revolution. If anything, secession is quite conservative. Certain aspects of secession, because you oftentimes secede. Catalonia wanted to secede. That's kind of like a nationalist revolt against, a broader identities. You know, you're getting a micro revolt. And again, the left is very internationalist. So those are my concluding comments. Anything to add, Swithin? Very interesting discussion. Thanks for doing it.
No, I would agree with secession. I mean, secession, you could really claim to a large extent is a counter-revolutionary phenomenon, and hence is somewhat conservative in certain respects. Although in the case of Catalonia, they do seem to be sort of somewhat economic, or almost national socialist in certain respects. The secessionists in Catalonia, although sprinkled with some cultural leftism as well, so that makes it sort of politically acceptable amongst the current upper circles. Just as a final point I made earlier, which you were saying I was verging towards Nietzscheanism. Basically, any revolutionary position which has a deep and sort of pessimistic view of society, the only real view that it can take is that they are enlightened, the plebs aren't, we should rule the plebs and the proletariat, and things will be better. I mean, that's ultimately what it will come down to, unless of course you have a position whereby you could somehow just influence society as such, sort of just pull them towards the correct outcome in a more sort of gentle manner. But to do that, though, would be to be less pessimistic than, say, that, as you point out, that Trotskyism would be. So I think really, if you're fully pessimistic about society, you have to be optimistic about yourself. You have to be optimistic about something, otherwise you couldn't change anything. You just have to be, pure despair, or pure sort of social determinism of some description. So that I think would be my concluding remark. I'd just now like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. And subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings. And if you have any questions or any comments that you want to send to us, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.